Welcome to the Daily Reminder Network.
He taught us, Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that this wealth, my dear brothers and sisters, is not ours. It belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah said He bought it from us in exchange for Jannah. In exchange for Jannah. And that is why we will be answerable regarding the time that we've spent and the wealth that we've spent when we meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of Qiyamah. If this time and this wealth was yours and mine, why should we be answerable about this time and wealth when we meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of Qiyamah? Why? It's ours. But no, my dear brothers and sisters, it belongs to Allah. And Allah, in His divine wisdom and mercy, He lent it to us in different proportions. Thus, He gave some people and lent them more time, so they lived longer. And others, He gave them less time, so they didn't live as long. And with others, He lent them more wealth, so they were richer. And others, He didn't lend them that much wealth, so they were slightly poorer. Allah distributed His wealth and these blessings amongst us as an amana. Now, I ask you, my dear brothers and sisters, whenever in this world we spend and we do not see an immediate return before the grave, we consider it what? A sacrifice, right? That's what we do. If somebody does charitable work, we say, thank you very much for your sacrifice. That's what we say, right? He gave his time, he wasn't paid for his time. That's a sacrifice. He gave his wealth and he didn't get anything in return before the grave. That is a sacrifice. But by Allah, I ask you, can you sacrifice something you don't own? Can you? If I gave you 10,000 ringgits and I said, so and so, I will call you next week and tell you where to transfer this money to. When I do so and you carry out the transfer, can I or can you tell the person who you transferred the money to, I've sent you some money, I've sacrificed it? Can you do that? You can't. It wasn't your money. You did no sacrifice whatsoever. You cannot sacrifice what you don't own, my dear brothers and sisters. If you understand that Allah has bought your time and He's bought your wealth in exchange for paradise, and He is the owner of this time and He is the owner of this wealth, we are not sacrificing anything, my dear brothers and sisters. We don't own it. But Allah is most merciful. He is perfect from ever and is perfect forever. He doesn't need you to spend in His path for Him to be greater. And if you don't, it won't remove from His majesty subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you do spend the way He has instructed you to do, and from your time and your wealth, what happens? Allah rewards you. And what do you call this situation? When you spend something and you get something greater in return, what is that called? Investment.
Donate now. Go to www.thedailyreminder.org/donate and stay updated by joining our network's social links.
Is there a simple way to understand how the wealth gap is created? Let's take a shot at it. Two people, person A and person B, get a job at company X. They make the same income. They both pay for the basics, like housing and food. Besides the basics, person A prefers to buy things that lose value over time, like a new car. The car is, of course, bought with a loan. Person B buys only the basics and accumulates any leftover as savings. Over time, person A continues to show a better standard of living but creates no wealth. Meanwhile, person B takes accumulated savings and invests them into a machine that makes gizmos. She operates the machine after hours and sells the gizmos during the weekends. There is decent demand for the gizmos and the machine is quickly paid for. Soon, a third person is hired to handle the machine and gizmo sales. All along, both maintain their job at company X. Person B continues to accumulate savings from her job plus the proceeds from the sales of the gizmos. These savings are later used to buy more machines, thus increasing the investable cash flows. Fast forward a few cycles, and person A continues to have a good standard of living from his job. Unfortunately, he has also failed to accumulate wealth. In comparison, person B has invested in income-generating machines and has accumulated great wealth thanks to the compounding effect of reinvesting earnings. The wealth gap is now massive, even when both have done their job at Company X just as well. No one acted badly at any moment. The only issue was that person A did not know about the benefits from compounding savings through investing. But that could easily be solved with a little education. The understanding that neither has been unfair with the other is what makes America what it is today. Here, our presidents don't discuss taking money from investors to give it to those who only spend. In other countries, on the other hand, people complain when others succeed. Not in America.
We can see that the money supply grows at a pretty fast rate. At the end of 2007, it was more than double what it was in 2002. So how does that come about? Well, that's one of the most fascinating aspects of the money supply. Banks can actually create money.
This is Mr. Smith. Let's say Mr. Smith goes to his bank, the First Bank, and deposits 10,000 Rand. Now, First Bank creates a demand deposit in Mr. Smith's name. This is a liability in the bank's financial accounts. It owes this money to Mr. Smith, and the bank must allow him to withdraw it whenever he wants. Now, how does this deposit affect the money supply? Well, the amount of cash in circulation outside the banking sector has decreased by 10,000 Rand. Note that cash, coin and banknotes held by banks are not considered part of the money supply. But while the amount of cash in the economy has fallen, demand deposits, indicated by the letter D, have increased by 10,000 Rand, the amount of Mr. Smith's deposit. The composition of M1 money has changed, but not the overall amount, so the money supply has not changed. But what is the bank going to do with this 10,000 Rand? Do they just lock it in a safe until Mr. Smith wants it back? Well, no. Banks, like any other business, want to make a profit. And one of the ways they do this is by lending Mr. Smith's money to other clients and charging them a higher interest rate than what they've offered to pay Mr. Smith.
So banks won't keep all the money, but will rather lend out some of it so that they can also earn interest. However, by law, banks are obliged to hold 2.5% of all deposits in the form of a cash reserve requirement with the South African Reserve Bank.
The bank's free to lend out the rest of it. They can generate income with 9,750 Rand that's not actually theirs. Now, assume the bank has another client, Mrs. Brown, who needs a loan. She needs 9,750 Rand, and she has a reliable credit history, so the bank approves the loan. In their books, this is an asset, since the money is owed back to them. The bank has acted as an intermediary. It's transferred Mr. Smith's surplus cash to Mrs. Brown. Now, Mrs. Brown then uses this loan to pay Speedy Motors, a down payment for the little car she's buying. Speedy Motors, in turn, deposits this payment in their bank, called Second Bank. And Second Bank then creates a demand deposit in their name for the amount of 9,750 Rand. Now, the money supply has changed. Remember, it didn't change with Mr. Smith's deposit, but by lending money to Mrs. Brown, who paid Speedy, who deposited that 9,750 Rand, a new demand deposit has been created. The banks are creating money. Second Bank can go on to lend most of that deposit to one of their customers, excluding the 2.5% cash reserve requirement, of course. And so it continues. With each new loan that banks approve, made possible by demand deposits from their customers, the money supply increases. Other financial institutions can act as intermediaries and transfer money from here to there. But banks are the only institutions that are allowed.
How Banks Create Money Out of Thin Air. Kalinda Rose Stevenson, Ph.D., NoMoneyLimits.com. The greatest limit to money is the belief that money is limited. How banks create money. Bankers know how to create money out of thin air. In fact, banks are money factories. You might think that banks are in business to provide services such as banking accounts and loans to their customers. It's true that banks provide essential financial services. However, the reason that the banks provide such services is that the banks exist to create money. As money factories, banks need money to use as raw material to create more money. Where does this money come from? It comes from customer deposits. In other words, it comes from the money you and I deposit into the bank. Notice very carefully, banks create money. It's not simply that banks earn profits when they provide bank services and loans. Banks actually create new money that did not exist before. Here is an example of how banks create money. You deposit $100,000 into a one-year certificate of deposit at 5% interest. The bank now can use your money to create loans. The Federal Reserve sets the reserve rate for the bank from 3 to 10%. A 3% reserve rate means that the bank must keep 3% of the $100,000 on reserve and can loan the remaining 97%. 3% of $100,000 is $3,000. 97% of $100,000 is $97,000, which means the bank can make a $97,000 loan. A 10% reserve rate means that the bank must keep 10% of the $100,000 on reserve and can loan the remaining 90%. 90% of $100,000 is $90,000, which the bank can loan. For our example, let's assume that the reserve rate is 10%. This allows the bank to loan $90,000 of your $100,000 deposit. So the bank makes loan number 1. The bank loans $90,000 and keeps $10,000 on reserve. This is the critical point where the bank creates money out of thin air. According to the bank's balance sheet, the $90,000 loan to the borrower is also a $90,000 asset for the bank. By its own brand of money magic, the bank has created $90,000 out of thin air. But the process does not stop here. Since the bank now has an asset of $90,000, it can make another loan based on this asset. Since the same Federal Reserve rules apply, the bank must keep 10% of this asset on reserve, This means it can loan only 90% of the $90,000, which is $81,000. This means that loan number 2 is $81,000. Do you see how this works? By creating another loan, the bank has created another asset. The $81,000 loan to the borrower becomes an $81,000 asset for the bank. Once again, the bank creates money out of thin air. And since the bank now has an additional $81,000 asset, it can make another loan. Once again, the bank must keep 10% of this asset on reserve. This means it can loan 90% of the $81,000 asset, which is $72,900. So loan number 3 is $72,900. Federal Reserve rules allow the bank to make 5 to 6 loans based on the original $100,000 deposit. Each loan creates an additional asset. We'll stop at 3 loans, review the process, and add up how much money the bank has created. You deposit $100,000 into a CD. The bank creates 3 loans based on the original $100,000 deposit. Loan 1 is $90,000, which also becomes asset number 1. Loan 2 is $81,000, which becomes asset number 2. Loan 3 is $72,900, which becomes asset number 3. When you add up these assets, the total is $243,900 in assets for the bank. This is $243,900 in new money. When you cash out your CD, you get your $100,000 deposit back, in addition to the 5% interest, which is $5,000. Meanwhile, the bank has created $243,900 of new money. If the numbers are confusing, go over them again until you see how magical this process is. This is how banks create money. To make this point, I have oversimplified the process. A bank doesn't really make a series of separate loans based on a single deposit. Your deposits become part of a pool of money the bank can use to make loans. But this oversimplified example demonstrates how banks create money out of thin air. A bank manufactures money by using the deposits of customers to make loans. The loans become assets, and the assets turn into money. What difference does it make to see how banks use money to create money? You and I can't do what banks do by loaning on the same money more than once. The real point of this example is to take some of the mystery out of money. The process a bank uses to create money demonstrates that money is not a commodity in limited supply, where there is only so much to go around. Money is not equivalent to currency. Money is created in money-making transactions, which means there is no potential limit to money. So if you want more money, think the way bankers think. Ask how you can use money to create more money. If you really think the way bankers think, you will use someone else's money to create more money. I leave you with this critical idea. The greatest limit to money is the belief that money is limited. Kalinda Rose Stevenson, Ph.D., NoMoneyLimits.com.
People are talking a lot about inequality these days, about the fact that the richest 1% have so much more than everybody else. But most of the focus seems to be on the United States, and it strikes me that the same story needs to be told about global inequality too. So I did some research, and this is what I found from reliable sources like the UN. It turns out that while the US is totally out of whack, things are actually way worse for the planet as a whole. Let's start with this graph. A perfectly even distribution of wealth among all living people, with everyone divided into 5 equal groups. Now, let's show how much each group actually has. Shocking, right? 80% of the world's people barely have any wealth. It's hard to even see them on the chart. Meanwhile, the richest 2%, they have more wealth than half of the rest of the world. Let's look at this chart another way. Let's take the whole world's population, all 7 billion of us, and reduce it to just a representative 100 individuals. Here they are, poorest people on the left, richest people on the right. Now let's show how the world's total wealth, roughly $223 trillion, is distributed. The vast majority have practically nothing. Nothing with which to educate their children, nothing with which to pay for basic medicines. While the richest 1%, they've accumulated 43% of our world's wealth. The bottom 80%, meanwhile, that's 8 out of every 10 people, have just 6% between them. But even this doesn't really show how extreme things have become. The richest 300 people on Earth have the same wealth as the poorest 3 billion. So the number of people it takes to fill a mid-sized commercial aircraft have more wealth than the populations of India, China, the US, and Brazil combined. We can also see this difference geographically, with a huge and growing gap between a few rich places versus the majority of the world. For most of history, things were much more equal. 200 years ago, rich countries were only 3 times richer than poor countries. By the end of colonialism in the 1960s, they were 35 times richer. Today, they're about 80 times richer. Rich countries try to compensate for this by giving aid to poor countries, about $130 billion each year. That's a lot of money. So then why does the wealth gap keep getting bigger? One reason I found is that large corporations are taking more than $900 billion out of poor countries each year through a form of tax avoidance called trade mispricing. On top of this, each year poor countries are paying about $600 billion in debt service to rich countries on loans that have already been paid off many times over. And then there's the money that poor countries lose from trade rules imposed by rich countries to get access to more resources and cheaper labor. Economists from the University of Massachusetts calculate that this costs poor countries about $500 billion a year. Altogether, that's more than $2 trillion that flows from some of the poorest parts of the world to the richest. Every year. Rich governments like to say they're helping poor countries develop. But who's developing who here? This makes me think that there's something wrong with the basic rules of the global economy. It can't be okay that the wealth of our planet is becoming so concentrated in the hands of such a tiny number of people. The only reasonable response, it seems to me, and our only hope, is to change the rules.
Hey, it's Mark Podolsky, the Land Geek, and here's another quick episode of Coffee Talk. Let's have a virtual cup of coffee together this morning. I'm really enjoying this Starbucks 2 Honey Americano. Let's talk about making money on our raw land. So I'm assuming you went to frontierpropertiesusa.com, you just bought your first piece of wholesale land from moi, and now you're like, well, now what do I do with it? Do I just sit with that raw land and pay taxes? No, you don't have to. You can use it any way you like for your enjoyment. I can also teach you how to flip that property as well. But let's assume that you want to hold it long term. Let's make some money on that land. So a few ideas to do this. I'm just going to run off a couple ideas. The first one is, hey, how about a paintball area, a little play area there. If you got a nice little flat piece of land and put out some signs, cordon off some of your property, get some haystacks, let's say, make a little paintball area, charge people $40 a person. After a while, that's going to add up. It's certainly going to pay for your inexpensive property taxes. How about pasturing animals? If you're in an area where there's ranchers, sure, charge them to let those animals roam on your land, eat your grass. Fantastic way to make some extra money. Don't forget about hunting rights. If you've got a property, let's say it's 40 acres, and you've got some deer on your property, why not lease it out to hunters? Camping. People love to camp, and there's never enough remote areas for them to camp. Put up a couple inexpensive camping sites, charge everyone a small fee, and after a while you're going to have a nice passive income for camping. Storage. Nobody ever has enough storage. Motorboats, horses, I don't know. It just, you've seen all these storage places all around the country, right? Why not store it on your property? Charge a monthly fee, and who knows, maybe you will be on Storage Wars yourself. So anyways, if you want to learn more tips, tricks, techniques, how to buy and sell raw land for passive income, active income, go to my site, www.thelandgeek.com. You can always click the links below as well. Listen to the podcast. Great information there. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. And of course, leave me a comment. Let me know how it's going here. What other information you'd like to learn. Anyways, thanks for having a cup of coffee with me. And I'll see you next time.
Maybe you're one of those people who needs more money. You work hard, or would like to, but bills pile up. Maybe you have skills or time that employers don't hire. Maybe your community needs more control over jobs, money, housing, fuel, food prices, and bank loans. Maybe you think our nation needs healing and planting more than war. So maybe you'd like the economy to be more fair and more fun. Rather than wait around for these good things to happen, we can print our own money, trade it for goods and services, then lend it interest-free. Community money is circulating in hundreds of communities worldwide, adding millions of dollars worth of spending power to local economies. They stimulate new businesses and green jobs. They strengthen the sense of community. Local currencies connect people, while national money just controls people. And they're legal. They don't replace dollars, they replace lack of dollars. Some city governments even accept them for taxes or fees. My book, Hometown Money, explains how to design, print, issue, promote, and grow a local currency. I've done it in Ithaca, New York, where millions of dollars worth of Ithaca hours have been traded since 1991. You can do it too. Just click the link below to begin.
Hello. Welcome to my video sample for my presentation on the topic of what I'm calling the old money way. Now what this basically is a discussion of a certain philosophy that originated from basically multi-generational wealth. Families that built fortunes would share this philosophy and pass it on to try and make a contribution to their societies as well as preserve their family wealth. And I should say that this emphasizes the sort of philosophy of how you should be spending your money. If you want to look at how you preserve and grow family businesses, I would recommend my presentation on family businesses. Now, this is specifically oriented towards inherited money, the idea being that once you have met all of your needs, I'll get to that in a moment, you are free to do with money that which is essentially the most high-minded uses for it. And this is to be specifically in contrast with what is oftentimes called new money, or described as, using the term of French origin, nouveau riche, which is, by the way, you should know, kind of a derogatory statement, because a lot of people who are new to money tend to spend it on frivolous indulgences and conspicuous consumption. And I think this is an important point of presentation, particularly in this day and age, for a couple of reasons. One of them is there's a lot of new money being created, and I think it's important to give a lot of those people sort of an exposure to a more classic philosophy so that they can avoid making any mistakes. Specifically, we see a lot of money being created in developing markets right now, fortunes being made in places like China and Brazil and Russia. We also see a lot of tech money being created in all countries. We also see a lot of financial services monies being created, hedge fund managers, private equity managers, if you will. And we even, despite what you might read in the news, have people making money the old-fashioned way, sort of starting their businesses, doing a better job, and building it over the long term. And I think I specifically created this presentation because I think it's something you don't get elsewhere. It's usually something that's been historically passed on through the family or through some of the higher social structures, if higher is a fair word to use. And you don't generally get it elsewhere. You don't get it from popular culture. If you look at a lot of the portrayals in popular culture of old money, they're sort of deliberately negative, and I'll get into why I suspect that is here. But anyway, I think it's important as a topic to cover. And also, even if you have experience, even if you were sort of raised with this philosophy, it's a good presentation because I think it gives you some frameworks. It puts a little bit of theoretical rigor about what your family might have raised you to believe intuitively. And so we're going to talk about a little bit about the philosophy, and then we're going to contrast it with some of the other philosophies, like a new money philosophy, if you will. And we're going to talk about the kind of conduct that would drive. And then we're going to talk about some of the misunderstandings, I think, that we see in portrayals in popular culture, things like that. And then, up till now, we will have been pretty complimentary towards this philosophy, but we're not just going to be rich people apologists here. We're going to take some specific, a critical look at it and talk about some of the ambiguities that this philosophy can create. So with that in mind, let's get started. First, let's talk a little bit about the philosophy, defining it itself. The best phrase that you could use to define the old money way is what I've heard called being beyond money, which means your needs have been fulfilled and you're now money is no longer the purpose, the objective, but now you're looking to do some higher-minded things, and money becomes a means, not an end. And oftentimes people will progress through what I've described here. Your first dollar you make, you're worried about fulfilling your needs, food and shelter for your family. But as you make more money, oftentimes you'll start to indulge yourself in certain hedonistic indulgences, fancier material consumption, and a higher lifestyle, more leisurely lifestyle. And then once you've sort of bought all the Mercedes that you can drive, you tend to go to the next level, which is money sort of becomes a point system. And so for this sort of indulgent period, you might be comparing yourself to your friends in the old neighborhood and showing them that you've really made it. Whereas when you get to the point system, now you're comparing yourself to your other affluent peers and seeing who's getting ahead the most. And then hopefully the highest order is that you get to the point where the money itself isn't the point and what it can get for you. It's the means to another end, and specifically the means to the end that I'm going to talk about is making a contribution. I'll get to that momentarily, but I want to make one more point on this, and that is, if you'll notice, this isn't a progression through high-minded sort of moralistic thinking. The means is probably the most high-minded, but serving the needs of your family is obviously important as well. It's actually these middle two that are the lowest in the sort of moralistic pecking order. I would argue that the point system is probably the most the lowest order thinking, because even in hedonism you're getting some pleasure from it, but the point system is sheer ego, and I think that's sort of the lowest minded way of looking at it. But anyway, the means that you want to get to is where your contribution to society becomes more important than your wealth. And if you get among the old money and the people who subscribe to this philosophy, you'll find that they judge people not necessarily based on who has the most money, but who's doing the right things with it, who's getting the most impact from what they have. The next point I want to talk about here is the idea of class, and it's important among old money to have class, but I want to be clear what that isn't. Unlike some of the portrayals you might find in popular culture, class is defined based on who's making the contribution, not how much money you have. It's also not necessarily on your family name. It's also not necessarily on your position. If you use your money to buy influence, you're the head of a company, you finance your own campaign for the Senate. It's not necessarily position either. It's what you're doing with it. And finally, it's not the rules. Oftentimes there's a lot of manners that come with some of these complicated social structures that you see among the old money. Classic analogy I'll use is which fork to use for which course. That's not what defines how you have class. What defines how you have class is how you treat people. And it's whether or not you're using what you have to make a contribution. But you'll hear phrases like, he's a class act, or he's all class. And we're going to get to that's kind of what that means, and that's what that should mean according to this philosophy. We'll get to whether or not that's a fair thing to do eventually. So if you're trying to make a contribution, let's dig down into what that means. How do you do that? Well, if you're how do you use your money to make a contribution? Well, on yourself, the most high-minded things to invest in are your education, or your skills or your experiences. And I always like to point out that the most important thing you can buy with money is not it's not sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's sort of consumption. That's fame. It's not even power, although I'll get to a point in that. The best thing you can use your money for is to buy options, meaning you have the ability to spend time developing your education or skills. You don't have to get straight into a job you don't like because you're paying off your loans. But it's also important to note that if you're raising people in a moneyed family, that options can be paralyzing, that it can breed sort of the paralysis of indecision. And I also get into a little bit in my live presentation about how we should think about power, because power becomes much like money. It's not the power itself that's the point, it's what you do with it. It's a means to an end. And so if you're using your power for contribution, then that's a good investment. If you're using your power for self-indulgence or self-empowerment, that's questionable. So that's how you spend it on yourself. How about how you spend it on others? Well, the obvious ones are philanthropy. Are you sharing it with others? Are you giving to charity? And also stewardship. Are you preserving important cultural and social institutions, or even objects, works of art, restoring architecture, things such as that? So that's a bit of the philosophy. Let's now contrast that with the sort of what's commonly called, I'll use quotes, new money. Well, the emphasis is going to be on building and preserving, because that's what makes the contribution, versus the consuming, which is more of the indulgence there. I'll get a little bit more into how the spending translates into preserving in a moment. It's also important to note that it contrasts because it's not worth success at any cost. There's a hip-hop artist, 50 Cent, who recorded an album that he called Get Rich or Die Trying. And that's kind of the new money philosophy. It's a good summary of a new money philosophy. The old money philosophy is the opposite of that, and that is there are certain things you don't do, because it's not just the success that's the point, it's the contribution. So I will not build wealth or fame or fortune at the expense of relationships. I want to be a class act, or at the expense of preserving important elements of culture. I'm not going to create a culture. I'm not going to participate in a race to the bottom. If there's a sort of an arms race of who can be the most vulgar to get the most attention, the most provocation, the most provocative publicity. And that leads us to the next point, which is about respect versus popularity. Sort of fame, celebrity culture puts the cart before the horse. Now, it's important to note that I don't think fame or celebrity is inconsistent with the old money philosophy, but much like money, it's not what you have, it's what you do with it. And specifically with celebrity, it's how you get it. So the idea, nowadays in a reality television culture, that's what I'm contrasting with, where celebrity in and of itself is the end, that's putting the cart before the horse. Among the old money philosophy, what you want to do is create you want to be making a contribution. If you're doing a great work of art, a great performance because you've developed your skills, then that's fine. You don't have to apologize for that. But it's not the objective. It's secondary. Don't put the cart before the horse. Also, celebrity tends to be about being known by as many strangers than it is, and oftentimes being resented by those who are close to you because you become callous towards them. That's the opposite. If you want to be a class act, you are most concerned with the people who are near you. And the last point I want to make here, which is a little bit of a controversial one, it's essentially you're saying that not everyone's opinion is equal. You want the respect, if you're making a contribution, you want to earn the respect of those who are the most, who have the best knowledge and most appreciation of the best performance. You don't want to participate in a race to the bottom or provocation. Even though some people might respect that and you might get attention for that, those aren't the people whose opinions you should be serving. And this can sort of, you're treading into dangerous territory, because this can easily go from high-mindedness to snobbery. We'll get to that momentarily when we talk about ambiguities. So that's a little bit of contrasting with some of the popular culture new money ways. Let's talk about how this translates into conduct. So if this is our philosophy, if this is how we want to be, how do we act? Well, the first one is it tends to emphasize the understatement. It is about because as we talked about with celebrity, the contribution is more important than the credit you get for it. And so you want to be understated. You don't want to show off. You don't seek publicity for its own sake. But it is more important to note that if you want to make a contribution, sometimes the media respects a certain degree of self-promotion. And so this is kind of a subtle point, but you are understated, but you can use your name, your fame, your wealth if it gets to an end that you want. So, for example, George Clooney uses his celebrity to highlight human rights violations, and that's consistent. Even though that's using celebrity, it's consistent with this philosophy. Another thing that you will oftentimes see is a lot of charitable donations are made anonymously. That's sort of the classic expression of that understatement. That it's about getting the job done, not about bringing attention to yourself. Also, let's now do what I talked about earlier, where I talked about building and preserving. Let's explore that a little bit. These are the more important things that you can spend on rather than consumption. And I specifically like to point out, when you're talking about preserving, some of these are more high-minded than others. So, for example, if you are collecting expensive works of art at auction, you could argue, well, I'm preserving important works of art for future generations. And that's true, but if you're bidding it up to multi-millions of dollars, someone else was going to buy it and preserve it anyway. So your incremental contribution is not as high-minded. You're actually being a bit more selfish in terms of buying that, because there are other things that aren't of that level that are important from a cultural perspective, but might not be economically viable on their own, and you can invest in restoring those things. And so I think restoration is a little bit more high-minded, a little bit more along the lines with this philosophy than just collecting. Furthermore, I have some tricks for how you can amplify your expenditures for restoration. For example, oftentimes there's something that could have some economic viability on its own, but it's not enough to justify the expense of preserving it. A good example of that is there's a British organization that really built a steam train from scratch because they thought it was important for the legacy of the country's rail system. But that was an expensive proposition, and it wouldn't have done it just on a P&L basis. But let's say if you have something that has no economic value and it costs $100 to restore, you can restore it and have one thing. But if you have multiple things that cost you $90, or that have $90 worth of economic value, but $100 restored, you can only spend $10 and have restore that. And so effectively, for the same $100, you could have 10 projects instead of one. So that's a trick for amplifying the value of your money when you're doing restoration work. Another thing I want to talk about is this is sort of what you invest in. It's also what you do with it. So if you have a collection that you bury in your basement that you don't share with anybody, saying I'm preserving it for the future generations, that's fair, but it's not as high-minded as showing it off, not showing it off, poor choice of terms, sharing it essentially with other people by showing it, and then actually letting other people use it by sharing it. That's the highest order. So for example, there's a British DJ named Chris Evans who collects Ferraris, and every year, you can take your Ferrari, you can keep them hidden in your garage, or you can take them to a car show, but he'll actually let people pay money to drive them. And he raises money for children's charities that way. And I think that's the most high-minded. If I had some of the cars he has in his collection, I don't know if I'd be that high-minded, but that's the right thing to do. That's the most consistent with this philosophy. He's sharing them with others, allowing other people to experience them for a good cause. Make sure I got everything I wanted to say on that. Also, how do you use help? That's an important element of conduct. Oftentimes you'll have servants, a staff. It's not just that you have them, it's what you do with them. So for example, if you're a rock star who likes to trash hotel rooms and you have a group of people that comes by and fixes all the mistakes you make, that is effectively using help, but it's using them for a very hedonistic, consumptive goal. Whereas you can also, another example of that is if you use your staff to do all the work for you so you can sit by the pool. Again, that's a hedonistic sort of life of leisure, which is really not surprisingly consistent with the old money way. A life of leisure is a phrase you'll oftentimes hear. That's a bit frowned upon. You should have more ambition than that and do something more positive. So the best use of help is to have a staff of people to do some of the other things for you so that you can focus on the things that make the greatest contribution, the things that you're specifically, exquisitely skilled in. And so that's a subtle point because, a rich rock star might have a staff that cleans up hotel rooms, and a rich business person, a retired business person might have a staff. They both have staffs, but what they're doing with them is very different. One's more high-minded than the other. And then the last point I want to talk about is, oftentimes we get into status brands and status consciousness. And I want to talk a little bit about the status of material objects, and that's brands is oftentimes a big expression of that in today's consumer culture. And I like to talk about why, when the most high-minded uses of brands, it should be, a brand can be a reflection of quality, or it can be a reflection of status. And clearly, the reflection of quality is the more high-minded thing to be paying for rather than the status. And I like to contrast that with something like purchasing replicas, which is essentially the opposite of what the old money should be valuing. Replicas are where you usually pay for the status, but not the quality. So that's the opposite of, that's the contradiction of this philosophy. So with that in mind, that's the conduct. Let's talk a little bit about some misunderstandings that oftentimes happen. If you look at the portrayals in popular culture of a lot of affluent people, powerful people, moneyed people, they're oftentimes portrayed as very snobby or uptight, which I define as meaning not sharing information easily, sharing much about themselves, or very square, which means very much following the rules. And those aren't totally unreasonable. I just want to explain why that impression why they might come off that way. In terms of these perceptions of being snooty or uptight, it's important to note that they oftentimes prefer to associate with other people who have similar backgrounds from the same schools, affluent families as well. But there are some reasons for that. One of them is its validation. If you're a person of money or power, every con man in the world wants to come and get a piece of you, wants you to invest in them, essentially. And by having this essentially comes to, by dealing with people who have the similar background, you're essentially filtering based on validation. It applies a filter so you can, if you get more offers than you know what to do with, it's a way of narrowing them down based on people who have effectively something to lose. Because if you're dealing with people who have a similar family reputation or a similar reputation at their same university, they have something to lose. Whereas a con man can just sort of use you, and if it heads they win, tails, they're no worse off because they didn't have a reputation to compromise. And a good example of that I use is recently here in Vegas, Prince Harry had some photos taken of him in his hotel suite where he was nude. It was a cell phone photo. And I'm betting that whoever took those photos probably wasn't a member of the royal family because they would have something to lose. He made the mistake of having someone around him that had nothing to lose, and they leaked the pictures. And that is one of the reasons that they might seem a little snobby, is because they don't want to associate with too many outsiders, because there can be consequences to that. The next thing I like to talk about is a couple of points on why I think pop culture, not only, here's some reasonable reasons why they might come to the conclusion. I think they tend to emphasize that. Oh, let me take a step back and make one point. One of the reasons that old money can end up feeling very square, they always follow the rules, is because it's back here to this not worth any cost. It's certainly not a good thing to break rules to get ahead, but it's even worse if you don't have to. And the theory is old money shouldn't have to cut the corners, and so that's why they'll end up coming off a bit square. People would judge them more harshly for violating certain social or legal standards. So back to what I was saying here. A couple points is, so why is there an incentive for pop culture to portray these people this way? Well, oftentimes the consumers of that popular culture aren't old money and might even be a bit jealous. And so there's a couple of points that they might like to think of dismiss these people as snobs or diminish them, because they themselves, the consumers, have a chip on their shoulder. They want to have a moral superiority over the people that have more, and so it's easy to dismiss them as snobs. Also, it's oftentimes more entertaining. If you watch Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, there's always some version of that type of show going on. It's more interesting to watch somebody who's doing something sort of celebrity or conspicuous consumption, hedonistic. That's more interesting than here's a wealthy retired guy who spends his days deciding what charities to write checks to. That's not very entertaining. But I think a lot of the classic example of this is it leads to a scene like I saw in Good Will Hunting, which came out when I was attending Harvard. And it portrayed Harvard students as sort of needing to prove something to their superiority to some of the working class members who were running in the same circle. And that's actually the opposite of my experience. If people who really adopt this philosophy, oftentimes are some of the most cooperative people that you meet, because they don't have anything to prove. So they don't because they have a certain degree of opportunity, they don't feel the need to one-up you. And likewise, if you say, well, I don't believe you, okay, then don't believe me. It's not something that they have to prove to you, or they don't seek the validation of others. So I found that that portrayal is particularly misleading. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the ambiguities that this can bring. We've talked a lot, we've sort of taken a pretty positive look at this kind of philosophy. Let's take a look at some of the areas where it might not be. Well, first of all, if you're a big Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman free market economist, oftentimes the assumption of those types of philosophies is that school of thought is that your contribution is always merited by profit. There's a perfect correlation. And that would sort of contradict my not worth any cost and contribution over wealth. That would sort of be a little bit conflict with that. That would sort of say your contribution will always be measured in the wealth that it creates. Another thing I like to talk about is, are we opening opportunity or lowering standards? Sometimes you can sort of be doing both, and you have to decide whether or not that's the right thing to do. I use the example of Wall Street. It used to be, if you wanted to work in high finance, you had to be a white heterosexual Protestant male from the Ivy League education of the United States or the Oxbridge education of England. And we've opened that up. Now there's a lot more opportunities in high finance, and that's generally the right thing to do. Different people, it's less discriminatory. But it's also harder to enforce discipline because now that there are more anonymous people in it, they might not have as much to lose. And I wonder if sometime, one of my pet theories is if perhaps one of the reasons we're having so much difficulty in the financial sector is because people are cashing in sooner and they're less concerned about the long-term reputation that they garner. And I think, generally speaking, opening up opportunity like that is the right thing to do, but it's important to note that we have to take the bad with the good, and we should be doing something to mitigate that. Also, I talked earlier about class, the difference between class and snobbery. While I do think that if you should be using class based on the right things, basically how you treat people, but not everybody has the same opportunity, not on money or fame or power. But it's important to note that even if you judge it based on how you treat other people, not everybody has had the same background, the same raising, and knows that. And are you discriminating against them because of the circumstances that they were born into, and effectively making yourself a snob? I think that's a debatable point. Also, I've talked a bit about the discrimination. Pardon me. Here, the idea is you associate with people who you share a background with because they have something to lose, and it validates. But first of all, that's discriminatory, which we talked a little bit about earlier. But that's almost, when I use my Wall Street example, I've used discrimination as like the accidental consequence. You could also be a little bit more cynical and say, look, it's not just accidental, some of it's deliberate. This is you scratch my back, I scratch yours. I'm going to associate, with the people of the same background, same power people, because we don't want to open this system up to competition, because then we won't be able to fleece the whole system, as you will. So, for example, in some mid-sized Latin American countries, there are complaints that there are only a handful of families that are large business and that own large businesses, and they expand those businesses for larger segments of the economy, and they support the political system to empower themselves. And it's not just an accidental consequence. The discrimination becomes deliberate. That's an easy transition to make without realizing it. And you can disguise that behind sort of a high-minded philosophy, but it's just lip service. Also, we want to talk about the systems where I say, there's a lot of respect for the systems. You don't succeed at any cost. You follow the rules, even if it makes you a bit square. But it's important to note that it's easy to follow rules because the rules of the system reward you if you're old money. Oftentimes, you wrote the rules. This is Mitt Romney likes to say, hey, look, I know I paid low taxes, but what do you want me to do? Pay more taxes than I owe? But then you could always argue, well, you'll notice his company was lobbying to keep the loophole for his industry low. So it's not necessarily a fair-minded rule. My favorite example of this is, if you're applying to an Ivy League school, it is considered against the rules to lie on your application. Say your GPA was higher than it was, because then you're not being decided on merit. But you are allowed to put if your family has been to this school for many generations, and if your father bought a building, sponsored a building for this university. Now, technically, that's not based on your merit either. You were just lucky who you were born to. You haven't accomplished that, and yet that is consistent with the rules. And so there's two examples of non-merit based reward. One is considered with the rules and the other one isn't. And so that's a question of, is that really a fair rule? The other point ancillary to that is pride. There's an expression, pride goeth before the fall. So it's easy to follow the rules when the rules are rewarding you, but oftentimes we'll find that when families are in danger of losing their wealth, all of a sudden they'll start to cut corners too. And so far we've talked about sort of rules and laws, but there's also sort of more subtle social rules. So for example, the understatement means that it's wrong to brag. But sometimes if you're not known, if you don't have a family business that's well known, you need to at least talk about yourself so that people understand that you're credible. And so at what point does credible become bragging? Same thing with self-promotion. Are you promoting yourself because you're interested in fame for its own sake? Or are you promoting yourself because you really think that there's a way that you can make a contribution? And so those are sort of subtle differences. It's ambiguous. Also, I want to talk about what's the difference between sharing and showing off. Recently here in Las Vegas, there was a $1 million wedding. It was sort of famous and covered by the news. An influential family spent $1 million for their wedding. Now you can make the argument that they were making a contribution by sharing a wonderful experience with their peers. You could also say they were showing off how much money they have. You could go either way on that. Personally, I think if it's something like that, I might be a little embarrassed to have $1 million wedding. I would rather have a much cheaper wedding and give $900 and some thousand to charity. I think that would be a greater level of contribution. But experiences are important, and that's a debatable point. Also, we should talk about at what point understatement becomes false humility. And is false humility a good thing? I find it kind of frustrating at times. I don't think you should have to apologize for your success. I'll use the example of a friend of mine. This isn't necessarily related to money, but he was a good golfer. And I said, hey, we're going golfing. You want to come? Are you a good golfer? He's like, I'm nothing fancy. And then it turns out he was a really good golfer, and I was partnered with him, and I was embarrassed because I was always having to wait for me. And you can make the argument that being disingenuous about how good you are is just as bad as being disingenuous about how bad you are, because I found that kind of frustrating. And then the last one I want to talk about is oftentimes in environments of old money, the social structures become so geared towards being a class act that you have to be courteous to everyone, and it's impolite to criticize anyone at the country club, if you will. But the point is, oftentimes if someone's doing something wrong, at what point is criticism valid? And are we glossing over correcting wrongs because for the sake of avoiding conflict? So that is generally my presentation on the old money way. I want to put a couple of things in the conclusion. One of them is, the bad news is oftentimes even people who have old money or from old money families don't necessarily abide by this. You can see sometimes the newer generations become indulgent or conspicuous consumption. Also, we can use this phrase, spoiled brats. They've been given everything, so they don't really focus on bettering themselves. But there's also good news, and that is you don't have to be old money to do this. You can be new money and do this. Bill Gates is using the Gates Foundation to give his wealth away. And frankly, you don't even have to have much money to do this. You don't have to be independently wealthy to recognize that the measure of a person should be what they contribute to society, not what they consume, and to be a class act and value relationships and dignity, and to not participate in races to the lowest common denominator. So with that in mind, I hope you found this interesting. If you'd like something like this presented at your event or organization, please contact me for a proposal at keithwhite.com. I look forward to doing business with you. Thank you.